continue with Many Lifetimes. It's a book by Joan Marshall Grant and her husband Dennis Kelsey, or her then husband. It was published in 1967, I think it was, and it gives accounts of cases they had in their respective practices, which were quite different. In chapter 5 we are now at the third reading, and it is Joan speaking about the cultivation of the senses. I continue. If the natural range of auditory perception is comparable to a full orchestra, many people hear only thuds from the drum or blasts from the trumpet. If our ears are constantly being assaulted by the shriek of brakes, the insistence of telephone bells, the parrot house screech of voices in competition, it is only too easy to believe that all of sound is potentially hostile. The cacophony of overpopulation has led to a society starved of silence, and it is a truism as well as a cliché that one needs silence in order to hear oneself think. The practice of wearing earplugs to shut noise out during sleep soon defeats its object, for the body relies on its ears to act as watchdogs, and when deprived of these natural guardians is likely to demand that the supraphysical aspects of the personality remain in attendance, which results in a shallow doze or insomnia instead of the far more refreshing process of a true level shift. The situation is in no way improved by the body being bludgeoned into apparent insensitivity by barbiturates. An even more prevalent way of trying to cope with noise is to leave the radio or record player going full blast until the eardrums are so exhausted by this battery that they become ineffective, even to the point of deafness. Another motive for this practice, especially among the young, is having failed to develop their other sensory resources, they have come to rely on a constant stream of noise to assure themselves that they exist. A baby gains self-confidence by finding he can make a noise other than by screaming, by shaking his rattle, or by banging his playpen with a wooden toy. I think the same mechanism causes infantile adolescents to be comforted by the fact that they can produce even louder sounds by flipping a switch or dropping a coin into a jukebox. One way to find the benison of silence, or at least comparative silence when living in a city, is to wake in the small hours of the night. When Dennis and I lived in London in a house on a very noisy street, I habitually woke at about 3:30 a.m. when my ears could listen to small sounds acutely, which I believe is an exercise exceedingly beneficial in maintaining a fully effective sense of hearing. I found myself instinctively walking at this same hour when we were in a hotel on Madison Avenue. Another useful auditory exercise is to listen intently to orchestral music, at first only following a theme and then a single instrument, such as a clarinet or flute. In the country it is much easier to train one's ears, for small sounds are clearly delineated against a backcloth of quietness. The sough of wind in the grass, the sibilant movement of a leaf, the plink of a toad, a note quite distinct from the reply from another toad further down the valley. With very little practice, one can literally feel one's eardrums vibrating, and they become lively instead of mere passive receptors of sound. A friend who was staying with us at our home in France commented that there seemed to be very few birds near the house, as there was a nightingale, two cuckoos, a nuthatch, several sparrows, tree creepers, blackbirds, and jays singing within 50 yards, and a woodpecker was hammering the bark of the walnut tree under which we were sitting. I presumed he was very deaf. I thought he might be able to recover his hearing if we could discover its supraphysical cause. So I embarked on a reminiscence, which I thought would be a tactful lead, saying that I too had been deaf for 3 months, after a fractious patient had boxed my ear and totally destroyed the drum. To the ear specialist's amazement, it recovered completely. He showed me my case history on which he had written, chances of recovery, nil. Instead of being comforted by my ready sympathy, my companion looked displeased and said coldly, I cannot imagine why you think I'm deaf. I happen to have unusually efficient hearing. So I told him to listen, but there's nothing to listen to. Then he paused and exclaimed, but there are dozens of birds. Now I can see them too. And the woods are resounding with cooing and crowing, and I've never noticed even a pigeon or a rook since I came here. Thereafter he woke himself at sunrise, so as not to miss the dawn chorus. The average person uses his eyes only to supply him with essential information. He uses them to read, to drive a car, to dodge buses, but he very seldom looks at anything. Teaching a child or even a grown-up to use his eyes is enormously rewarding. The joys of exploring a rock pool have been described in many autobiographies, but a few square yards of an ordinary meadow can provide material for hours of observation. Probably at least 50 different kinds of leaves and a number of engaging insects and beetles. What have you seen today? Is a question which should evoke an increasingly rich and varied response, and a person who is too purblind to notice that his eyes have shown him, whatever his age, should be told that he is therefore infinitely more boring than he need be. Anyone who drives through beautiful scenery, so intent on getting to his destination as quickly as possible that he is aware of nothing except road signs and the car in front which he is trying to pass, should be made to realize that he is not only depriving himself of pleasure, but demonstrating his inadequacy as a companion. Nothing is more damping than to travel, even along a familiar road, with someone whose response is always, I didn't notice. I was walking with 2 friends recently when I stopped to watch an ant's nest. I was crouching on my haunches so as to get a closer view of a complicated bridging operation which was being carried out with remarkable speed and cooperation, when one of my companions asked anxiously whether I was feeling faint. They had not even noticed the ants. However, they got the message and handed it on. The next time we went to stay with them, their son, aged 4, was lying face downwards on the lawn. His mother called to him, and he looked up only long enough to whisper, "Shush, I'm very busy watching my beetle." His parents said that instead of often being bored and constantly demanding new toys, he was now able to amuse himself for hours by finding fresh things to look at. The country child has an unending range of things to discover, providing he's been put on a track of doing so. But the town child has equal, if different, opportunities for enjoying his vision. When Gillian was less than 2 years old, we discovered the museum game, through having been driven into the Victoria and Albert by a sudden downpour when on our way for a walk in Hyde Park. I was wondering how best to exercise her and hoping to find a deserted gallery where we could play hide and seek round the showcases, when she suddenly stopped and pointed at a wax figure, one of about a dozen displaying historical costumes, and said, "What kind of chair did that woman sit on?" The clothes were of the Queen Anne period, so we went to the gallery of 18th century furniture. I expected Gillian's interest to wane after a few minutes, but instead she studied the different types of chairs with the absorbed interest of an antiquarian. Our heroine had by now been named Mary Ann, and having chosen her chair, we paid the same attention to selecting the furniture in which she could keep her clothes, a walnut lowboy and a bow-fronted chest, and then added a desk at which she could write her letters. Many times we returned to the V&A, because Gillian wanted to see the knives and forks Mary Ann ate with, the candlesticks for her table, the embroideries which would have occupied her leisure, the musical instruments she played, the carriage she rode in to visit her friends. Sometimes I only kept one jump ahead of her, expanding interest by looking up the relevant facts in the London Library. We discovered the food Mary Ann served to her guests, how it was cooked, how many servants she kept, and their various duties, and where she went for her holidays. We learned still more about her by visiting Kew Gardens and looking at the flowers she would have grown in her borders. This was easy, for I only had to consult Saunders' Encyclopedia of Gardening, which lists plants indigenous to England, the date on which they were first introduced, and their familiar, as well as their botanical names. Angel's tears, love in the mist, and hare's ear are far easier to remember and much more evocative than Narcissus triandrus, albus, nigella, and papylurum. Without for a moment feeling that she was being educated, Gillian gained a wide-angle view, not only of an earlier century, but of many related subjects. It gave her the ability to correlate information, to fit each item of data into a much larger framework. Easy. I cannot stress hard enough how important it is for children to have their senses developed far younger than is usually considered practicable. The demand for the same story to be read over and over again is not prompted by a desire for it to be repeated, but because the child is starved for fresh looks, fresh stories, fresh pictures to stimulate his imagination. The only exception I found to this was when Gillian, aged 4, insisted that the same little grey rabbit book should be read to her 5 evenings running. She then took it from my hand and said, "Now I will read to you for a change," and to my amazement did so, without getting a word wrong. She had just reached the final page when her father came into the room and said, "Isn't Gillian clever? She can actually read, and I didn't know she had even learned the alphabet." She repeated the performance, and he too was impressed. We were congratulating her when she suddenly burst into giggles, turned a somersault on her bed, and shouted, "But how can you both be so silly? Of course I can't read yet. I just learned the book by heart as a joke." Pictures can be far more interesting, even to a small child, than a picture book, especially if these are made the focus of an impromptu story, either made up by the child herself or told in a way which will capture her interest. The interest which a 4-year-old child can take is something apparently as unexciting as someone else's family portraits, was shown by Gillian saying to a hostess, "The woman in the blue dress in the drawing room here has much prettier flowers in the posy she is holding than she has in the picture of her in the dining room in your other house." Her hostess, intrigued that Gillian had noticed that there were in fact 2 portraits for she had only once been to a luncheon in the other house, and that was several months previously, said, "The flowers are exactly the same. Both portraits were painted by Peter Lely, but the other one is an identical copy." Then he must have got tired of doing the same thing twice and done different flowers, said Julian stoutly. For the flowers are different. The other one has got a red rose bud instead of a pink one, and there are forget-me-nots and a white flower I don't know the name of. The conversation ended in the three of us driving 50 miles to settle the argument. Julian's observation proved to be right. The sense of touch is cultivated by the blind and by those who follow professions such as surgery or sculpture. But in the majority of people it is the most grievously neglected of all the top five senses. Yet, in many ways it is the most important, for it can transmit the vital energy of affection. From infancy, most of us are deprived of the identification provided by skin-to-skin contact. Although this is sometimes prescribed for delicate babies under the chilling heading of TLC, tender loving care. Very few children have the natural solace of being caressed in mutual nakedness, even by their parents, so it is not in the least surprising that they grow up with such a pressure of unsatisfied longing that they try to assuage it during adolescence by premature and pitifully ineffectual sexual experiments. Ineffectual because it is not sex they really crave, it is the physical affection which, as their body memory of more kindly cultures is constantly reminding them, is their natural right. To test the validity of this statement, try to communicate with an animal without touching it. Continue talking to your dog, walking your dog, feeding your dog, but refrain from touching him and allow him to touch you and see what happens. At first, he will be bewildered, and then, presuming that you are angry with him, he will produce symptoms of guilt. Continue with this experiment, even for a day, and the dog, according to his character, will either mope or whine or snarl at you or run away. I believe that by failing to give our children the comfort and reassurance that we still give to our animals, we cause them to follow the same patterns of reactions. They mope or whine or snarl at us or run away to join the lonely hordes of juvenile delinquents. The modern child seldom suffers from clothes which cause its flesh to cringe and disgust as did the children of my generation. The harsh wool combinations, the starched petticoats and drawers, whose gouged frills felt sharp as razors, the elastic which cut a ridge under our tender chins to clamp huge hats onto our sensitive scalps are no longer standard torture. But babies still have to endure the horrid impediment of woolly gloves and become entangled in woolly shawls and are unlikely to have the freedom of nakedness for which their skin hungers. I think the least one can do for children is to let them run about naked whenever they like, as did all the children who lived at Trilliaden. This not only gave them a much better posture, because the body, which is allowed its natural freedom, has an innate dignity, but spares them the psychological hazards which can arise from the implication that there is something nasty about nakedness. At one time I had 9 children living with me, 6 males and 3 females, whose ages ranged from 7 to 17. They wore clothes only when it was necessary to conform with other people's conventions, or to protect themselves from cold or brambles. They shared baths with each other and with my husband and me. I often found 2 or 3 of them curled up in bed together like puppies in a basket. But in spite of the gloomy predictions of my acquaintances, there were no sexual complications whatever. It was interesting how quickly visiting adults adapted themselves to these natural conditions. I well remember a Methodist minister from the Middle West who spent a few days with us on his way home from a mission to Africa. I met him on a train, and finding that his knowledge of English geography was sketchy, for he was hoping to see Lomond, the Lorna Doone country, and Shakespeare's birthplace in 48 hours, an impractical ambition without a helicopter. I directed him to Stratford-on-Avon and suggested that he should fill in the rest of this time by visiting an English country house. He arrived the following afternoon, and I was a little anxious as to how he would react when we went down to the lake to bathe. I thought of telling everyone to wear a swimming suit, but discarded the idea because it would have caused the children to regard him as an oddity. I'll stop this here for now. Today is the 9th of September 2024.